Just let me give you a little bit of context for the discussion that we're going to have. About 3 years ago, Macalester went through a strategic planning process. And among the priorities we identified in that process were to do a better job with career development for our students and to continue to build and grow our programs in entrepreneurship. And the roles that Mindy and Kate are playing are critical to helping us carry out those strategic priorities. So we have identified these things as central to what we want Macalester's version of liberal education to be in the next 10 or 15 years. And so what we want to try to explore in this conversation is what the implications of that are. How does liberal education look different now than it might have in the past, and how does this emphasis on the vocational and on entrepreneurship affect what we're doing? What are the good things? What are the challenges? So one of the things that Kate and Mindy have in common is that each one is the first at Macalester of what they're doing. Mindy is our first Dean of Career Development, and Kate is our first Entrepreneur in Residence. And so my initial question to you has to do with that. Being the first of anything can be both exciting and challenging. And so what I'd like each of you to reflect on a little bit is what's been exciting and really interesting about being the first, and what's been challenging about being the first in your positions. And not just the first holding a job, but the first, I think, pursuing a particular initiative in the way that you are. So Mindy, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a fun question. I think being the first at Macalester in particular in career development is an interesting place to be. Any liberal arts institution, right? But there's a particular way about Macalester students and values that Macalester students bring to the work that they do that needs to be infused in all of the work that we do. So it's not like I could have taken a career development curriculum or a way that we've done things in sort of my previous experience and just plopped it on top of Macalester. That wouldn't work here. So for me, the super exciting thing was talking to people at Macalester and talking to our students and talking to our faculty and talking to our parents and talking to the community around us to figure out how to Macify the work that we do. I say that a lot.
You could put Mac on any word.
Yeah. But that's been really, really fun and really interesting work because there have been things that I've learned about the MAC community that are really surprising. So a great example might be the top 3 places that employ Macalester students. Let's say last year, the Peace Corps, which you would probably, think, Epic, which is a software company, tech company, right, and US Bank. So you go, okay, how do we serve a student population where those are the top 3 places that employ our students? So that's a fun challenge. In terms of what's been most challenging, I think, is to bring everybody along for the ride, right? And to be very clear that what we want for students in the Career Development Center is not a particular outcome. It's whatever outcome they want it to be. You want to lead sled dog teams in Alaska, wonderful. You want to work at US Bank, wonderful, but we want to give you the tools to get there. So it's been a challenge to bring everybody along with that vision.
Mm-hmm. Kate?
Yeah, I think similar to Mindy, I always like to say I didn't arrive and entrepreneurship appeared. Same for you, right? Career just didn't appear when Mindy arrived. And I'm a 2000 Mac alum as well, so I had kind of a longer purview of what was going on at Macalester. And I like to think of my role as a gardener, and that I didn't come in and say...
That's a new metaphor for you.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Let me know how you feel in the Q&A about this metaphor. So I've always thought that I didn't come in and plant a bunch of stuff. There's actually been this really, really lively garden of kind of entrepreneurial thought at Macalester since I was a student and well before, and that my goal has been to look at the whole garden and not to encourage everyone to monocrop corn, but to think about the fertilizer that we might need, which of course would be organic, but to think about what are the things that we need to put in place to help spur places in the garden that need more tending. What else might we want to plant? What are the things that don't fit necessarily but are still important? And so just kind of thinking about the strategy of entrepreneurship as continue to grow what's already there, but think strategically about what's possible. I think one of the challenges that we face is a definitional challenge, where entrepreneurship can feel like a destination to start a company or to start a thing, and we really think of it, and our students think of it as seeking solutions to problems. And so how do we manage those who maybe don't understand what we're doing because they embody a definition that actually isn't what the programming looks like? And that's one of our challenges.
So your job is to spread fertilizer.
Organic fertilizer.
Organic fertilizer. You have to be a bit careful with that metaphor. You know where it's going.
I see where you're going with that.
Yeah. So talk a little bit, let's start with you, Kate, about is there a sort of a typical Macalester student right now who's interested in entrepreneurship? Is there a profile? Is it varied? I mean, one associates it, a lot of people associate it with students who come from areas like computer science, maybe economics. Mm-hmm. What have you found about where the students who participate in some of these programs are coming from?
It's so varied. In the beginning, I thought we would see a skew in that direction. And certainly, I teach an Intro to Entrepreneurship class in the econ department, teach 2 classes. So my econ class has heavy econ students. I teach Intro to Social Entrepreneurship in the fall, and that's in sociology and international studies. And so obviously, we lean in that direction. In our programming, I have no idea when a student walks in what their major is, what their minor is, what their concentration is. What they share in common is this kind of compulsion and this sense of like, I don't like the status quo and I want to do something about it. And so there's this feeling of curiosity and urgency to want to solve problems. And we find that is true, cross-discipline. And often in the beginning, very much based on the student's own experience of what they experienced growing up, or they saw their families, or they come from family of entrepreneurs, and so they kind of know that they don't have to accept the world the way it is, and they want to make an impact. Mm-hmm.
Similar question for you, Mindy. Do you notice that certain kinds of students, certain categories of students seem more focused on the question of vocation than others?
Yes, I think. I think it's some of those majors that you mentioned. I think we often see econ students early, math, stats, computer science students for sure. And some of that's about the recruiting cycles, right? I mean, we're here in a tech hub, and those recruiting cycles just start earlier for those students. And so some of it is about just their knowledge that they need to get started earlier. So we do see some of that. So we're working really hard to make sure that the campus doesn't feel like those are the only students who we're serving, right? Just because they come to us early doesn't mean we should be serving them in an outsized way. And so we've taken our career counselors, and those career counselors always used to be generalist career counselors, so they would work with any student who came in with any major. And we've now split our career counselors so they have a divisional home. And in that way, then a student who is an art student or a student who's a dance student who might come to that a little bit later still has a person and gets specialized support and service. So it's not just about your early piqued interest being your point of entry and access.
It seems to me that the question of vocation, of jobs, in relation to a liberal arts education gets criticized from 2 opposite directions. There are some people who say that the liberal arts doesn't focus enough on the vocational and the practical, that you're spending all of this money on a really expensive education and you're not coming out with the kind of vocational skills that you'd get if you went to an engineering program or to a more specialized computer science program. Mm-hmm. And then at the other extreme, you get people who say, it's really important that the liberal arts not become too vocational.
Yep.
That If we start to think about getting a job as the goal of an education, what's going to happen to programs like classics? What's going to happen to programs like philosophy? You get some people who say we're not doing enough of it, and then you get other people who say that we're doing too much of it.
Right.
So do you find yourself responding to both of those critiques?
For sure. And I think that the we're doing too much of it is a really privileged position. We have first generation students who need to think about what life after college will be and don't have the privilege to not think about that. With the cost of higher education post-recession, it's not something families ignore. And so that, in my head, that's not a position that we are privileged enough to be able to take as an institution. So I think the beauty of being somewhere like Macalester is we can do both, right? So we have these fantastic students who bring a really deep-seated value system, and if my team can help give them the skill set to be able to translate that into whatever it is, that feels much more recession-proof, right? If we can build critical thinkers and we can build people who can write well and we can build people who can work on teams, and I can just teach them to go out and talk about that in the world, then we're doing the right thing for both sides of the table.
Mindy mentioned the question of privilege. Kate, do you find a similar dynamic when you deal with entrepreneurship? That is, differences among different groups of students based upon whether they're first generation or not, whether they're students of color or not. Is there a different attitude among different groups of students toward being entrepreneurial?
I often think students who are first generation students are most entrepreneurial students, because they themselves had to imagine a world that they didn't necessarily see and built it. I think what we do hear from students, and this is often domestic students of color and international students, is they come to Mac and they say, my family is a family of entrepreneurs, and I want my story to be part of what's here. And one of the things I think that's hard for them, and in some of the challenging ways that people say like entrepreneurship shouldn't be here, is that that's often students who are saying, because entrepreneurs only look like Mark Zuckerberg, and yet we have students, and the data show that the students actually, people of color, immigrants start more businesses. I mean, the data actually shows that entrepreneurship is a much broader thing, and so for students to hear that definition and yet not even have it be reflected as truth for them, I think is one of the most challenging things. And I think one of the reasons that they like working in our department is because we have hundreds of students who look like them, and they find commonalities across kind of that entrepreneurial mindset.
So both of you are essentially in the business of trying to prepare students for a future that we can't predict and that we don't know.
Right.
When you were at Macalester, Facebook didn't exist.
I didn't have a cell phone.
Right. So,
Cell phone? No,
so
that old.
So Mindy, how do you prepare students for careers when we don't even know what the main jobs are going to be 15 years from now?
Well, and this is why a liberal arts education is so valuable, right? Because we're preparing them with this broad range of skills. And so in my head, my job is not about teaching students technical skills, because those technical skills in 5 years will be obsolete and they're going to need to learn them in a whole different way. My job is about teaching them how to be agile and how to look for opportunity and how to connect with people to build their networks. All those really transferable skills that they can use now at where the world of work looks like when they're 22, but also when they're 50 and trying to figure out what their next career move will be. So in my head, it's not necessarily about that it's kind of, it's very general, the knowledge that we need to teach them from my perspective, because the technical pieces will come as they get out into the world of work.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the answer to that question is?
I think it's the same answer that it's always been, is that if you teach students how to think and how to be creative and how to work in teams and how to be adaptive, then you're going to prepare them for the fact that they're going to have 6 different jobs during the course of their careers. If anything, I would argue it's probably more important now, because it does seem, we do tend to have always a presentist bias. We always think the present moment is different from the past.
Yeah.
But I do think the pace of change seems to be accelerating. The likelihood that the careers that they will be pursuing in 20 years is dramatically higher than probably it's ever been.
Yeah.
But there is no evidence that those same fundamental skills aren't still the same ones that work. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that once students who graduate from a liberal arts college are 15 or 20 years out from their degree, they are doing better off, not just in some abstract sense, but financially.
That's right.
Than students who have a more narrowly defined degree. It doesn't always feel that way when you're 3 years from graduation.
Yep.
But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, on average, that is in fact what happens.
That's right. Their at-graduation salaries are lower than their peers in more technical fields, but by 10 years out, they've basically made that up.
Right.
Yep.
Which, as a side note, is one of my complaints about the way the government tends to evaluate the value of education.
Right.
The federal government has a scorecard in which they rank colleges, and one of the things they look at is salaries. I think it's 5 years after graduation. Well, 5 years after graduation, a lot of our students are in graduate and professional school.
That's right.
And so it seems to me that you're taking a misleading sample if you're trying to evaluate the value of something at that point.
Yep.
Another question for each of you. We have alumni in the room from lots of different generations. What is the one thing that you're doing or program that you have right now that you think is kind of the coolest and would make alumni most resentful about the fact that they didn't have it when they were there?
Should I go first?
Go ahead.
I think for me, it's probably a fund that we call the Live It Fund, which I always say is this wild, imaginative fund that I don't really understand, but it's defined by the students who are doing it. So the Live It Fund was proposed by students, and it's a fund to allow students to live out their definition of global citizenship. And so they get funding from about $500 to up to $10,000. To do incredible projects we funded a student team last January to go down to the Juarez-El Paso border and look at how art was made across the border. And they produced a documentary, and then they showed it at a film festival this year. We've had students do incredible things in that fund, and I think selfishly for me, I would have wanted that fund. And when you see what students are working on, it fills you with an incredible amount of hope that things will be okay, or there will be pockets of places that are okay. I haven't gotten to the whole thing's okay yet.
Right.
I have to pick one.
Yeah.
Well, you can pick 2.
Okay, I'm going to take 2. I'm glad I went second. One of the things that alum get really excited about, and they say, no, wait, you have what? With divisional support in the Olin Rice Science Center came a space that we call the Hub. And the Hub is, literally a glass building sort of space in the middle of a building that students physically run into when they go into the Olin Rice Science Center. And it's housed both our science career counselor and then a faculty member who helps students find research positions. And that space is magical. It's magical because, again, you literally bump into it, so students can't not get the support that they need. But it's also magical because what you see happening is you see faculty physically taking students over to that space and saying, you have a career question, here's Amanda, your science career counselor, here's your person. So my dream would be a hub space like that for every division because it's transformative. The second thing that I think leverages our urban location in a way that very few other colleges can do is a program we call Mac Explore. For Mac Explore, what we do is we take students on a lunch hour, Tuesday or Thursday lunch hour, groups of about 8 to 10 students, and we literally put them in an Uber, and we drive them to one of the many cool locations around the Twin Cities where they could possibly imagine what their careers could be like. So it could be Minnesota Public Radio, it could be a corporate location, it could be state government, and they sit for an hour and they talk with alum not only about what their day-to-day work looks like, but how they live out their MAC values in their work. The trickiest piece is then we make them ride back in an Uber with a career counselor. So then we process that experience with them and help them think about the next steps. And so I love that program. It's perfect for young students. And very quickly students can say, I fit there, like those are my people, or I thought I wanted to do that, and now that I've spent an hour there, that's not right. And that's just as valuable as it being an affirmative experience.
So what program or thing would you like us to have 10 years from now that we don't have in each of your areas? So I know you're always thinking about entrepreneurship, not just in terms of what its current iteration is, but you are always about growth. It's never about staying the same.
Yeah.
So you know what we're doing now. We have the Live It Fund, we have the Dream It Fund, we have Macathon, we have Mac Nest. I told you we attached the name Mac to everything. We have summer startups. They have the classes that you teach.
Mac startups.
Mac startups, right. So,
Macified everything.
so 10 years from now, what are the things that, if this program continues to evolve, you would like to see us have?
Yeah. I'd like this in 5 years, but the but
Is this going to turn into a budget request?
yeah. No, it is a budget. But you know, I've been really inspired by how the alum Fred Swaniker has built the African Leadership Academies, and how he thinks about students essentially pick a mission, and then they work through the equivalent of college on that mission. And so what I would love to do at Macalester is to think about a fellowship program where students could come in and either their first year or their sophomore year propose a problem that they cared about solving, and then continue to pick a major, but then pick an advisor and a curricular path that would give them kind of the trans-departmental skills and content that they would need to solve that problem. Their summer of their sophomore year, end of their sophomore year, I'd like them to do a funded internship working alongside someone who's trying to solve a piece of that problem. And then the summer of their junior year, I'd like them to do the equivalent of a Live It Fund or a Mac Startups, where they actually propose and attempt to implement what they think a solution might look like. And then they essentially do a capstone their senior year on pulling together all these pieces.
So obviously, things like the fellowships and the internships cost money. Other than money, what are the impediments to making that real?
Probably not very many things. We still need money. But you know, I think it's about finding the way how to think about some of the curricular pathways that might be more normal, what the cohort side would need to be, because I think the really important piece of this and what we see in a lot of our programming is that there's value in being in a cohort. And so how do we think about the time and the staffing needed to support a cohort development? So it's not, you know, I think the value of what we can provide in the kind of the residential liberal arts experience is many things, but one of them is the chance to reflect within a group. And so finding kind of what the right programmatic structure is to encourage that, and then again, kind of how it fits and maps through the curriculum.
Mindy, how about you?
My budget request?
Yes.
You only get one.
I only get one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take one this time. Mine is actually related to Kate's, and we've had this conversation before. It would be a funded summer experience for all students. And so whether that's a funded summer research experience or an experience like Mac Nest or an experience like a traditional summer internship, there are a great number of our students who can't afford to do an unpaid summer internship. We surveyed about 500 of our students who did internships last year, and we said, did you have the opportunity to even look at an unpaid internship? And 65% of our students said that they couldn't even consider an unpaid internship. And so if we could take that barrier away for all of our students, that would be a dream. And internships are the most predictive factor in terms of long-term ability to get into the career that you're interested in getting into. So if we can cross that off a list for students, we're getting there.
If there's one thing that you could change about Macalester, what would it be? Be honest. We're among friends.
I'll answer that question. We've gone through a lot of change in the Career Development Center, structural change, vision change, and I think change is hard for Mac sometimes. And so I think if some of those kind of entrenched pieces, if we could break down some of those barriers, I think that would certainly make some of this a little bit easier.
That was very politely said.
Do I have to be polite?
No, no. In fact, I don't expect it.
I think we've been thinking a lot at Macalester about questions of equity and inclusivity. And we see a lot, often in our programming, when students are working on projects in their classes or are working through the 10-week accelerator or in our hackathon, they're solving problems that they experience. And we've seen in the last couple of years questions of belonging on campus. It's a heartbreaking question to see students grapple with, and I think we think about it as the staff and faculty, and they think about it as well. And I often think that the question of belonging dovetails into the irony of an open mind, which can seem so open and yet feel closed to students. And so I would, changing it and making everyone seem to belong doesn't even seem possible, but I do wish that at the end of the 4 years that all students had experiences of deep belonging, and I think they do. I just wish it was a more universally held experience.
That's a great observation, I think, on which to open it up. So we're now going to take questions.
I never heard of the Live It Fund. And
You can mention it to
Great
the fund
opportunity. It's something that we never had at the time. I'm just curious, how do you get the funding? And more specifically, how would a student like my son apply to something like this? Is this like a proposal of some sort? It's like a grant proposal of such?
Yeah. Well, you can tell him he got an email yesterday or today with the grant application for the summer.
You might begin by telling him to read his email.
Yeah, that would.
Okay.
Yeah, just generally that's good advice.
Right.
So so it's an open call, and we do our best to really widely publicize it. And so we encourage students to apply that way. He can also reach out to me if he wants to learn more about it. That's funded through a little bit of an endowment, gifts, and then from the president's office as well. And so that's a fund that has a few different pockets that we draw from.
And just to add to that, I would say of all of the things that have happened in my time at Macalester, the creation of the Live It Fund was probably the most student-driven. It was literally created when a group of students who at the time were what we called the Student Council of the Institute for Global Citizenship came up with this idea and came to me and said, we want to do this. We want to have this fund. At the time, what they said is we want it to be overseen and decided upon by students. So you give us the money and we'll figure out what to do with it. And students will apply, and we'll decide who gets funded. It has evolved over time. We have found that it works better with a little bit more staff and faculty oversight. Students still play a critical role in it, but they work in partnership with Kate and with others to make sure that the proposals are feasible. But it's still true to that fundamental vision that the students had, which is let us decide what global citizenship means. You don't tell us. Let us decide what it means for us and try to test those definitions through projects. And if there's anything frustrating about it, it's that we can never meet the demand. There are always more good proposals than we have the capacity to fund. And that's true of a lot of the things that all of the programs that Mindy and Kate are describing have more students interested in them than we are able to serve. And one of the goals that we have longer term is to be able to serve more of those students through these programs.
I was a person that went to Macalester College that had no idea what I wanted to be in life, and stumbled into it because of a passion. And so after graduate school, I get more graduate students calling me seeking advice about my profession than Macalester. So I'm just curious to know, now that there's a strong career development office, how can we, because we all have eclectic backgrounds, can help?
Thank you for that. We love that kind of help. Right now, the easiest way for you all to help is to go out to Mac Direct and to make sure that you are noted as a career helper. What we do when we do any sort of programming, especially in other cities, we go first to that list of career helpers to ask for help in terms of panels or hosting events, et cetera. And when students come to us and they say they're interested in a particular career, we'll pull a list from that Mac Direct database, and now anyone who's a career helper goes to the top of that list. And so if you need help figuring out how to do that, let us know. We can get you there, but that's kind of first and foremost. The other thing is if you need interns, if you need full-time employees, let us know. We now have built out a full employer relations team whose full-time job it is to get those positions posted and to build relationships with people. And so that's been a huge success for us. And as we've started to ask alum for help, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And so if you have any of those things, please let me know, and we're happy to get those in front of our students.
So I'm guessing you get feedback from recent grads who've gone through both the entrepreneurship and the career development programs. When you get that feedback, what do they say? What do they wish they could have had, or what do they really like?
Our feedback from, say, for example, programming or career counseling evaluations, things like that, feedback is overwhelmingly positive. The bigger challenge is to get students in the door, right? Which is why we've moved to divisional support and hubs. So we talk about it as a career ecosystem versus a place. And so how do we become a part of their life versus them having to come to us? Once they interact with us, it's a really positive experience. We get really great feedback, but we just need to get them in our door.
Students also really love the opportunity to work in our programs. The one thing that I think is really frustrating for students is they've worked on this thing over the summer, or they've gotten a funded internship in a startup, and they want to move forward, and it's hard for them to navigate within the curriculum, right? So the currency for students is time, and time is credits. And it's hard, they don't have a pathway through the curriculum that is clearly entrepreneurial. And so it's often they're kind of left with like, I want to keep working on this thing, but I have all these other things I want to do, and there's no space for me to navigate that. And so I think that's one of the challenges and the barriers, and I think the things that they wish that they had a little more flexibility.
Guess I was curious, the Olin Rice divisional support sounds really great. As a graduate with an anthropology degree in sort of social sciences, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what that divisional support looks like in social sciences. And I guess just like my perspective was, I realized at some point I didn't want to go on to grad school in anthropology. And then beyond that, at the time, the general career support was very general. But to think about, oh, well, now looking back where I am in my career, I might have gone to grad school for urban planning or something like that more quickly with that kind of, so I'm curious about the social science.
Yeah, good question. So the divisional support exists for each division. The most physical manifestation of that is the Olin Rice Hub, mainly because we sort of had the space to do it in Olin Rice, and there was transformation happening there anyway structurally. So we sort of jumped on that opportunity. So what we've done with the other divisions is it's largely presence and then programmatic changes. And so really good examples would be things like in the social sciences, we just did a mini Mac Connect in the Twin Cities for 2 days all around careers in law. And so we had alumni panels the first night, and then we took students to 4 different iterations of what a career in law might look like all over the course of 1 day. In the arts building, we do things like the Working Artists series. So we do, again, panels of young alum who are working artists who can come back and say, how do I piece together a gig job so that this is a reasonable future for me? We also work really closely with the faculty. So we say to the faculty, in the context of your courses, what can we help you do? So some of those Mac Explorer trips that we talked about are actually partnerships really specifically with faculty within a division. So we'll say, in teaching your sophomore class, what do you want them to see, and how can we make this easy for you? We will take care of all the logistics. You tell us where you want to go, faculty member, and we'll take care of the whole thing. So there's kind of this whole package of programmatic support that those counselors do, but then they're also physically in that space. And so even if we don't have a hub, those career counselors are doing walk-in hours in whatever buildings are the closest to those divisional spaces, so that physically those students start to be able to see those career counselors. And we talk about them imprinting on them, like, oh, like, you're my person, I see you all the time. So I think you'd be shocked at how kind of robust the programming's become that's really specific to those different divisions.
As a former international student, after graduation, like many of us, I've grappled with visa issues and sort of figuring out how can I stay here? How can I continue the life that I've built in a place that I moved to after graduation? What, if anything, is Macalester doing to prepare international students for the harsh reality of, you might have to move, you might have to dream it all up again in a new place that you didn't really have an intention of being in?
Yeah, we work very, very closely with ISP specifically on that. And it's a gravity problem, right? I mean, it's not a problem that we as an institution can fix. And it's a problem that has continued to get more and more challenging with the current administration. So the number of visas that are available, the number of folks who apply in the H-1B visa lottery, even if a student is lucky enough to be selected by an employer to be hired, the chances of them getting picked in the H-1B visa lottery are minuscule. A great example, we had a fabulous international student this year land a job at McKinsey Consulting, sort of the plum job that she wanted, got the offer, worked for them a year on her OPT visa as she could, and then didn't get picked in the visa lottery.
And I've had the exact same experience.
Yep. So they transferred her internationally, gratefully, for another year of work experience as they try to reapply. So some of the things that we're doing, this employer relations team that I've talked about, Michelle Moylan, our Assistant Director of Employer Relations, as we speak, is working on a project for alternate paths for our international students. And so how do we talk to international students about the possibility of working in places like Canada or Australia? I know, right? I mean, we would love to keep students here, but it's a little bit easier in some of those places. So we're sort of gathering our knowledge and information about that so that we can be good guides for them. The other thing that we're doing is really talking with international students much earlier in their experience. And so it used to be, again, we waited for people to come to us. And when you're an international student, if you don't hear until you're a junior and you're looking for an internship that in fact you won't likely be able to stay in the United States, that's really challenging. So we work really hard to get in front of those international students really early. The last thing I'll say is that our employer relations team works tirelessly to work and find companies who are willing to sponsor and hire international students. So at least to widen the funnel as much as we possibly can on the front end.
How do you support students in thinking ethically about entrepreneurship under the conditions of market capitalism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that came up last night as well. So I think one of my theories is I'm a little bit more of a realist than maybe I was 20 years ago, and that I want as many Macalester students working to start things in a capitalist system as possible, because I think that if we assume we're doing our work right broadly as an institution, then we've got people who are in starting businesses, NGOs and nonprofits who actually have an ethical guide in their work. And so I think the first thing I think about is giving people, Macalester students, as many tools so that they can continue to build the institutions that we want to see and the things we believe in. Mac students arrive in my classes and in our programs already thinking about these questions. And so it's not, I don't think of like an ethics day, right? And then like we've checked off the ethics day and then we go on to like intellectual property and we check off the intellectual property. Like that's not, I don't think that's sufficient to the demands of what you see here and the complexity of the issues that students need to consider. The one thing I've observed most often in students is they will think about things like sustainability questions. They'll think about what the broad impact of the business is that they want to start. One of the things they don't think about is how much it actually costs to pay people a living wage and what you have to do to actually afford to be able to do that and build your organization, right? And so in some ways, some of the deepest ethical considerations that I think we actually grapple with is how expensive it is to do innovative work. And I hope that what happens to students is that they actually develop a deeper sense of compassion for people who are actually starting things and trying to solve problems, to understand how complicated it is, right? Because it is very easy to read a 60-page article about all the things somebody's doing wrong in trying to solve a problem. And once students start to actually solve that problem, I think they develop a great sense of hopefully curiosity and less fear about how challenging it is to work in that space.
You made a point about people in the sense of belonging, and I think it was interesting because I believe one of the contests that was held on campus was run by a group of African American women. And
That won it?
right.
Yeah, sorry.
And
I didn't understand.
it's interesting because when I started thinking, I mean, the ideal is to say entrepreneurs, a lot of people of color families had businesses. Their families were entrepreneurs. And so I was just thinking in terms of how might you start looking at those students on campus where they can start learning the tools to give back to their family.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we've actually got a class that is happening this spring and cross-listed between sociology and economics, and it's called the Evolution of African American Entrepreneurship. It's actually the class I have most wanted to be taught. And it's actually a book that I think it's many books, but there's actually a, in getting the course approved, one of the things I heard from the sociology department is a recognition that it is not a well-studied experience. But it is a foundational part of how this country has been built. And so so we actually have brought in a African-American woman who's a practitioner in the Twin Cities who helps African-American and women entrepreneurs get access to capital. So that's her work. And so she's going to teach a phenomenal course. But on Fridays, they're summarizing their Monday, Wednesday learnings through hip hop. Because that's a great place of a ton of African-American entrepreneurship. And so that's a good example of some of the things that we're trying to do to open this space up. And again, the evidence is there, right? That these businesses have been, come from West African traditions, and that's why that's some of the evolution of what you see. The second thing is that we've done we've been in partnership with the DML, the Department of Multicultural Life, and last year wrote a grant to fund a student, and then we both worked on a project called Raise Your Hand. It was a student idea that was, she had been working in my social entrepreneurship class on a project for essentially like change makers and innovators to help them get access to resources. There's a ton of resources on the internet, but it's so hard for people to sift through and find what's there. And so she had this idea of building a platform for students to start to share their experiences to other students with a particular focus of kind of the DML students, so students of color, first-gen students. And so what it currently is, it's a little bit in beta form, but there's about 35 videos, they're about 45 seconds long, of mostly students of color and first-gen students talking about like their one magical thing that they know how to do really well or what they learned. So we've got a student who talks about the value of asking for help, and another student who talked about the value of resiliency, and they're 45-second videos. And what we're trying to do in that is to open up spaces and allow students to see that their experiences are actually shared across time, right? So these students will then graduate and be alums, but their videos will still be featured. So those are kind of two distinct examples where we're working on those questions.
I'm class of 2014, and I'm now a high school teacher at kind of a similarly fancy private school in the Bay Area. And you kind of mentioned the difficulty of finding curricular pathways through a traditional academic program for some things that are trying to build 21st century skills and all these other buzzwords that are being thrown around in education. So, independent schools and the public school system at the secondary level are, this is a moment where every educational institution is talking about similar initiatives. So, like, what kind of buy-in do you have from the faculty to start reimagining and opening up the curriculum?
It's a great question, and the honest answer is it's really hard.
Yeah.
Education does many things well, change isn't one of them. Kate mentioned Fred Swaniker's African Leadership Academy. Fred graduated, I think, in '97, and he established first a high school and now a university, African Leadership University. And he had the advantage of starting a school from scratch. And I often fantasize about what I would do if I had the opportunity to actually start a college from scratch.
Is this a budget request?
No. Absent all of the tradition and absent all of the things that are ossified. And in all honesty, I would probably not have majors as they are currently defined, and I would probably not have departments as they're currently defined. About the only place that knowledge is divided into those kinds of segments is at colleges. But once you leave college, as basically I think all of you know, the kinds of things you actually deal with, the kinds of problems that you grapple with, are not defined through the lens exclusively of economics or English or philosophy. They interweave and overlap. I really love the idea that Fred came up with of having students, when they enter, choose a challenge, choose an issue, choose a question, choose a problem, and then organize their education around attempts to wrestle with that and bringing in various perspectives. Getting from where we are right now to there is going to be really, really hard. I actually think it's easier to do at new places. Another place that's doing something like that is about 10 or 15 years ago, Yale started a new liberal arts college in Singapore, and it's got some real issues, particularly because of the policies in Singapore. But one of the things they've done that's really creative is essentially do away with departments and organize themselves around some of these challenging areas. I think the biggest challenge that both Kate and Mindy face, and they've been very, I think, graceful about talking about it, is some of that resistance to change. I do think, honestly, we're better at it at Macalester than a lot of places. I think Macalester is not generally a complacent institution. It's an institution that really does always aspire to be better. We don't always succeed, but we try. And so I actually think we're doing a lot more of these things than many schools like us. I think what we're doing in both career development and entrepreneurship is very different from what I saw at the two liberal arts colleges where my sons went, and very different from what I see at a lot of other institutions. So it's a great, you're asking kind of a central question, and the answer is it's really hard, but I think we have an opportunity to make that change happen at a slightly faster pace than many other places.
The argument to that, right, on the career side is, well, if a student doesn't have a major, then how does that link to a career, right? Because there's these careers that have really particular major necessary classes that go along with it. And we're finding more and more that now that recruiters have figured out how to solve the problem of how to find students with artificial intelligence and the ability to look at resumes that are skill-based, that the majors become less and less important. So we're in this really great time where if we were to really leverage what we have, we're finding fewer and fewer recruiters who say, I'm going to pick 12 core schools and those are the only schools that I'm going to go to because that's where my leadership graduated from and I will recruit only from these majors. We're hearing from recruiters that they want much more diversity in their candidates, very broadly defined. And so we're in a position to be a real leader here if we're willing to change.
So many thoughts about everything that you've said, and just to kind of tee off what you said about the organization of the majors, I think that that type of vision really feeds into an entrepreneurial spirit towards your education, which is what you've talked about, which is really focusing on a problem that you want to solve, and then, you know, weaving together your education around that to support you. And one of the things that helped me there was being able to do cores and being able to supplement 2 cores instead of majors and do that on my own. But my question has to do with teeing off the internship opportunities. And I was fortunate enough to kind of create my own J-term job, and would have been even easier if I would have had some funding to do that, because I had to choose between that and some income that I desperately needed. But it ended up turning into a job and turning into a career for me. And it was a little bit on the periphery of my vision. I don't know if I would have gone to the Career Center and said, oh, you know, I want to do that. And it ended up being one of those careers that didn't exist back then. And so I'm wondering what kind of ways, maybe even using technology to seed those types of opportunities in the periphery zones, maybe like cultivating, for example, an online discussion where you could have a group of students in a certain realm where they think they're exploring this kind of question, and then invite a bunch of alumni maybe to jump in online in a teleconference and say what they're doing, to sort of overcome those geographical barriers and also time barriers, because you can sort of have a larger impact with that.
Yeah.
And also to overcome those sort of vision barriers where you might not have gone after that person, but you heard them on a conversation like that, and you're like, oh my gosh, that sounds really interesting. I didn't even know you could do that.
That was one of the primary purposes of why we came to the Mac Explore program, because we wanted students to students can't do what they can't envision, right? Our associate director of employer relations says that all the time. And so if we could make it easy and bite-sized for them to get out and look at something that wasn't tied to, oh, I'm doing this because maybe I want to interview at that place. We very specifically called it Mac Explore for that reason, that we could help sort of broaden those opportunities and just what's even possible. The other program that we're doing right now that's helped us do that is a program called Alumni Chats. And so in the new space that Kate has in the library on the second floor, we use some of those spaces to virtually bring alum in, and up to 8 students can go in and have a very casual conversation, either virtually, or if an alum is in the Twin Cities, we'll physically bring them there. And it's a very casual conversation. We serve them lunch, and they can go in and talk about any questions they might have. But when we market those, we don't market them based on major. So we don't talk about major at all. We talk about either geography, or we talk about industry, or we talk about it as an issue-based thing. So maybe how I lived out my identity in the workplace. And in that way, students can kind of pop from session to session and try some things out without it being risky or having to be a full summer's worth of an internship. We love those experiences for students. They're super valuable.
Institutions are only as good as the people that they have, and I think you can see that we are very fortunate at Macalester to have Kate and Mindy, and please join me in thanking them.